This discussion is about how to shoot fireworks with your DSLR camera. Shooting fireworks can be challenging because it requires you do some unusual things with your camera, things that you don't normally do when taking photos. So that's what I'm going to discuss, is what I do when I try to shoot fireworks. I apologize, by the way, for this coming after the 4th, but there were some things I just wanted to try. First, let me talk about some key items. Use a tripod because you're going to be doing exposures of 1 to 6 seconds. Use bulb setting on your shutter release. Use a shutter release cable to minimize camera shake. And remove screw-on protective filters from the lens. By the way, in the photos that I will show here, I forgot to remove the screw-on protective filters. Use ISO of 100 or 200. Use the slowest ISO that your camera has. My camera has the slowest ISO of 200. Use an aperture of f16 to f22. Very, very small aperture. And one other comment is use manual settings on your focus. I set my camera and my lens and focus it manually on infinity. Because of the very small apertures, this provides me a very, very sharp image. Turn off noise reduction, or at least don't have it turned up any higher than normal. Probably best to turn it off. Now a bit about f-numbers, because f-numbers are complicated, and how f-numbers relate to the amount of light that goes into your camera is complicated, and it's not obvious. You have to do a bit of math, and can be a real challenge for people who have trouble with math. So let me talk here about the comparison between f16 and f22. The table I show actually has 3 f-numbers, but I will focus my discussion on f16 and f22. So with f16, first thing I do is divide the f-number by 2. I call that f sub 2, by the way. 16 divided by 2 is 8. Then I take 8 and I square it. That gives me 64. Do the same thing with f22. 22 divided by 2 is 11. 11 squared is 121. 121 is about twice 64. Not exactly, but about twice. What that means is that f22 gives you half the light in the camera, as does f16. Let me say that a slightly different way. 64 is about half of 121, which means that f16 gives you twice the light as f22. The equipment that I use, that I used this past 4th to shoot fireworks, I use my Nikon D3. Love the D3 because of its great low noise characteristics. I also used my Nikon 18 to 35 wide angle zoom with the widest aperture of f3.5. But of course that's not important because we are going to be using very small apertures. A bit about post-processing. I use Apple's Aperture program, and I use the dynamic range enhancement tools to darken the bright areas and lighten the dark areas. I use the highlight slider to darken the bright areas. I use the shadow slider to lighten the dark areas. I increase saturation a bit, play a bit perhaps with contrast if needed, and I crop for best effect. The cropping is important because when you're taking the photo, you don't know exactly where the fireworks will appear within your frame. So you must use a pretty wide angle view of the scene. and then crop it afterwards to get the best effect and the best photograph. Here's a before and after example after having gone through that process. The image on the left is the before image. The image on the right is the after image. That's after I have darkened the light areas, lightened the dark areas, increased saturation slightly, and cropped the image. For me, one of the most noticeable effects is the small star-like points of light that surround the innermost green starburst of the fireworks. It's much better, much brighter looking in the image on the right. Now let me go through several other images and I'll give you exactly the settings I used to take each photograph. On this image I used an exposure of 5.3 seconds, an aperture of f/22, ISO 200, like I said, it's the smallest ISO setting, slowest ISO setting on my Nikon D3, and a 28mm focal length on the lens. This image, exposure time 6.1 seconds, aperture f/22, ISO 200, again 28mm focal length on the lens. Now, the aperture is, I only change occasionally depending on whether the fireworks are getting brighter or darker or whether the smoky haze around the fireworks is bright or dark. The exposure time I control by using this thumb switch on my remote cable shutter release button. So again, it's a bit of a guess. I try to guess how long it takes the fireworks to get to their full presentation, and again guessing about whether the image is bright or not, and do I want to go for a longer exposure or a shorter exposure. This image was only exposed for 4.6 seconds, quite a bit shorter exposure than the previous image. Did this because the fireworks were so bright, so intense. An aperture of f/20, which is what I had the camera set on, ISO 200, again a 28mm focal length. This image right here was only using an exposure time of 1 second, an aperture of f/20, an ISO of 200, and again a 28mm focal length on the lens. The shorter exposure time increases the color saturation in the smoke cloud around the central part of the fireworks. So you get a very, very nice red hue on this smoke. So what I would suggest is go out and try it. And next time there are fireworks in town, remember your tripod, set your camera up in advance, get there early to beat the crowd, find a good spot, and then do some experiments and give it a try. I think you'll find you'll get some great, great, great fireworks photographs.